I am about to introduce you to Susan McGee from Homeward Trust. Not unlike, really every organization, there is a complexity to a not-for-profit. I'm thinking about some of the complexity that I discussed with Susan, including governance and bureaucracy and construction and development or project management, client care, not-for-profit sector in general, logistics, etc. There are so many things involved in what Susan does. And what I find fascinating consistently, I shouldn't be surprised by this ever, is there are certain themes that are kind of come up over and over and over to having an organization perform at a very high level. One that I'll just mention right now is that fit is important no matter what type of organization or sector you are in. Sometimes we think, oh, well, this is going to be a little bit different, therefore we should run things a little bit differently. And from this conversation with Susan, it was absolutely clear that fit is always going to be important no matter what kind of organization you are involved in or are running. What I want you to listen for in this episode is to how Susan uses language around homelessness, or I'll use the term being unhoused. Susan is very careful with how she uses words. And while this may not seem like it is maybe valuable for another industry or sector, I completely disagree. I believe that the way we use words, and we know this, the way we use words is marketing. And we are always marketing to other people. We're always marketing to or teaching staff, government organizations, partner agencies, community members, participants, whatever, at every level. So what I want you to do in the next 45 minutes is allow yourself to be challenged in how you think about homelessness or people who are unhoused in this conversation. It just took 45 minutes for me to change a lot of my own thinking. Enjoy the listen. Welcome to this episode of the Traits Podcast, where again, the focus is on building higher performing organizations. I'm excited today because it's a unique organization that we're bringing to the forefront when we're talking about higher performance and a unique voice with that. So Susan McGee is joining me today for this interview. And maybe what I'll start off with, Susan, is just start by sharing your own story, your background, what brought you to the place you are now with Homeward Trust, and then I'll ask some other questions about Homeward Trust in a little bit here.
Well, thanks. I'm looking forward to the conversation, Mark. I'm really love the work that I get to do in community, and I certainly didn't get here in probably a typical route or a predictable route. I've actually spent my career in nonprofits, other than some hospitality stuff in university that many of us have done, and I studied architecture actually, and at that point in my life realized that really my interest in that was as much about community building as it was about buildings. And I had moved to Toronto to do that, moved back, lived in a community in Edmonton, Macaulay, and really connected with community development through working in partnership with people in the community, mobilizing efforts. I worked for the Downtown Development Corporation for 13 years, was their executive director. It's no longer, but it was a part-time company, nonprofit company focused on projects to revitalize downtown. And I've been with my organization now for 20 years, and it started I started as an executive director of Joint Planning Committee on Housing, which was two staff. We merged with the Edmonton Housing Trust Fund a couple of years later. They had 12 staff, and then we've grown the organization. And I've really been here 20 years, but I've had in that course probably, a dozen careers, it feels like, because we've grown a lot. We've taken on a lot of new roles and challenges, and in that interim managed to, have kids, get an MBA, and continue to work on my career in different ways.
In other words, you sit on your rear end and they're basically a couch potato for the last 20 years, right? You don't do anything with your time. It's so funny
Well, it's a compulsion.
It's so funny listening to entrepreneurs because entrepreneurs are driven people and they're driven to make things happen, driven towards their goals. I'm fascinated to talk a little bit about this, but I know that there are other things that I want to get into as well. So before I do that, I'm just very curious about this. What do you believe your background in architecture has brought to the table with Homeward Trust?
Well, I probably could digress a little bit around that. I probably should have been an engineer. My brother would have loved for me to be an engineer, but my friends were all creative, so architecture kind of checked more boxes. And it wasn't for me, but it also taught me a lot around what really is design thinking, and you can apply problem solving approaches to a lot of problems when you think about, just that whole entire process of unpacking problems, which for from an architectural perspective are addressed through design and really thoughtful design, but just the entire process of breaking down problems and assembling them, assembling the solution in a design approach has helped me a lot. There's other things that probably have helped me, like having to do all-nighters to finish a project, only to have it thrown out because it didn't check all the boxes. And then you start over and you just keep going. It's not unusual to have to do that as a student in a design world. So, you suck it up and you start over.
And tackle problems as they come, right?
Mhm,
That's just
mhm,
the way it is.
mhm.
Now you talking about a little bit about Homeward Trust. I want to maybe open that box a little bit. What is Homeward Trust? Tell me what it's all about. What are you guys doing? You've talked about a lot of iterations here, but and a lot of growth, which we're going to get into later on this in this episode as well. But yeah, maybe explain what Homeward Trust is for people.
So, yeah, absolutely. And from a governance perspective, there's a way of describing Homeward Trust as a nonprofit. It's actually, there is a trust, which is an indenture of trust, and then we have a society that serves as a trustee. And then we have a related company that we have five other subsidiaries through that company, a social enterprise. It's Find Edmonton. It's a retail store, donates furniture and also provides furniture at no cost to folks uh, coming out of homelessness. And we have development companies and portfolios within the holdings company that we develop and manage as well. So that's the structure. The story of Homeward Trust in terms of responding to community need. And as I mentioned earlier, it was, two community-based organizations, very grounded in, I think, what is some of Edmonton's secret sauce is just people really care about the city. They volunteer, they build organizations, and the organization that came out of that through a merger then, the timing of it was also at the time we were launching in our community with Mayor Mandel at the time launched the first 10-year plan to end homelessness, and Homeward Trust was the management kind of entity responsible for delivering the resources. We kind of describe that part of our business as an aggregator of public resources. We allocate funding to high performing programs. We also describe ourselves sometimes as a general contractor that's been contracted in homelessness, and we subcontract to a lot of organizations that specialize in aspects of that work. So it has been a growth in some ways, just, meeting a need, but also, by any means necessary. It's a huge social problem. It costs lives. Homelessness is something that we do know we can end because we've ended it over and over and over again for thousands of people. But it also is, you need to be nimble and respond to opportunities and changes in priorities. So the organization has grown and restructured in response to that over time.
Talk about the size a little bit because you gave a hint of how it started with two P. You started with another person. How big is Homeward Trust right now? What is part of the crisis that we've talked about before with Homeward Trust and the growth it's experienced?
Well, through that structure, one thing, for instance, a social enterprise is it's very labor intensive. So in total, there's about 200 folks that work within the organization in one capacity or another in one of our organizations. But that 200 people, the retail side, I mean, we've got drivers, folks on the floor, prepping materials. So that's got a lot of people in logistics. The other core aspects of the organization are actually quite small. Like we have a whole data and analytics team, finance, obviously, and contracting. But that administrative side is smaller. It has grown with scale, but it's about 55 people. And then we have in the housing development space, we do a lot of managing projects, and those projects have different operators that we contract. We're supporting many people with complex needs, and sometimes that requires a lot more hands-on than you might see in other residential properties from a property management perspective. So that's a fairly large team, but they all are, specialized parts of the whole. We come together to make a kind of cohesive capacity to address this issue, but they're quite different functions.
Something we've talked about a couple of times is experiences that I've had, and that is I have worked not for profits, and in that I've often been disappointed because I often find it's led by somebody who is has a really good spirit or heart or desire to help others, and they are driven to do that, but they've gotten themselves in a little over their heads. Now they're finding they've got to raise capital and they have to run a larger organization, and really they ever wanted to do was help people. How Because I think that there are not-for-profits out there that are struggling in different ways. Homeward Trust is a very different organization, and I get excited as I speak with you, Susan, because of what you're doing. How is Homeward Trust different, and how does having, this might put you in an awkward spot, but having a true leader at the forefront as CEO help an organization like yours?
Well, I would say, one of the things about my whole career is I've always really appreciated the folks that have mentored me. And there's been a lot of fantastic leadership in nonprofits that have done that. And if not, directly peers that I, still consider, to be teaching me all the time, but have set some pretty high bars. So there is that. But then, I think there are folks that from a career perspective, yeah, they may get into socially oriented, and it may not just be in this sector, but the nonprofit sector. It's a major part of our economy. But what attracts somebody may not meet or align with some of the things that uh, like there's a lot of administration in it. Honestly, that's not my jam. I can be good at it, but I've been fortunate to work with folks that compensate for that. So I can see where some people might have those strengths and it puts them in a position of leadership, but that person may not then have the really more creative problem-solving motivation that another leader has. And so I think it's not surprising that if you have a sector or I don't want to say industry, but if you have roles where what attracts people in the first place isn't the actual work, and there's a misfit, um, that's going to show up then in what the work is and how they do the work and the quality of the work and what they can produce if that alignment isn't there in the first place.
That makes complete sense. I looked at your traits profile before jumping on the call or other calls that I've had with you, and what stands out is it's very similar to a lot of entrepreneurs, people who get things done on a larger scale, not on a smaller scale, not a solopreneur, but somebody who gets things done on a larger scale and manages a very significant organization. One thing that I'm excited about in this conversation is talking about higher performing organizations from a different perspective. So maybe explain how your organization or your sector is different than other organizations, and maybe some of the challenges that you run into that might be a little bit different than others.
As an organization, we've had some real high points and we've had times of challenge, and with growth, we've been stretched sometimes to grow too fast. And then, we catch up with ourselves. So it's not surprising that I would look back and see evidence of the organization that's really high performing, but I was also sitting in it at the time, maybe not feeling like we were as high performing as we appeared to be because we were catching up with ourselves. And in those iterations, I know too that scale has meant like we've needed bench strength and to attract and like recruit folks in roles that can deal with the complexity of a large organization. Um, Honestly, I think people have been surprised coming into Homeward Trust thinking and maybe devaluing or assuming nonprofits are, they're easy. Yeah, I'll sleepwalk into this job. And we're quite surprised by how much was needed of them and what they were expected to do and how how it was not, and they weren't able to sleepwalk into that job. So I think that there's been times where, I've certainly learned a lot over, again, I feel like I've had two jobs, but in each of them 20, but always those moments where, okay, why did I not get that? Like, why did I think this would be successful when, somebody had core skills, but they just didn't have the urgency that our organization requires, as an example. And so I look at that kind of like ups and downs. And then when it's humming and things are going really well and you've got like the right folks in the right roles, but also, yeah, we benefit from a lot of community support and having that, connection to community and the opportunities to have that is so important. That's a feedback loop. You and we don't have the profit margin that gives that feedback loop. We rely on other feedback loops. And so from that perspective, that and when the organization is when that's palpable, it drives everybody. It can really motivate everybody. So it's been yes, at times very much a high performing organization, but with that moments definitely where it might have been wiser to press pause, but we got to do our job and we have to do it well because quite frankly, people die when we don't. So you don't get that, pressing pause moment, but I've learned from all of those times.
Hmm. A few things jump out to me. One is you're talking about feedback loop, but this is a type of accountability that you have. And again, that's so important because I believe that sometimes the perception out there is that not-for-profits are kind of these obese, inefficient organizations, and they don't have to be. They can be run really, really well, really efficiently, and get far more done. But again, it requires people to have a different mindset, like you've said, which we've talked about in this podcast so many times: culture and fit for positions. With I was thinking about themes, and something that comes up constantly when speaking with you or when speaking to other people when I ask questions about you is nuance and precision in communication. Communication comes up a lot. I don't think I've had a conversation with you where communication has not come up. Maybe set the stage for that a little bit. What do you mean by nuance and precision in communication? What is the importance of authenticity and language problems or problems with language? Maybe set that up for us a little bit.
Yeah, it's an interesting dimension, particularly if we think about the traits profile and how it might get. And I've been confused sometimes by my profile around detail, for instance. I'm actually pretty low on detail, but and you might misinterpret that to be not specifically concerned about nuance and communication. And I think precision and detail are really different things. And we are working in, homelessness is political regardless of the environment you're in. And I mean that because, people have strong feelings about it. They have many people, whether it's one degree, one family member away, have had an experience of somebody who has had either experienced houselessness or they've had a lot of risk. And so it tends to be something that when people have that kind of level of examination of a topic, language really matters. How we describe ourselves, how we talk to people, our authenticity. I mean, the audience that we engage can be government relations, but it is as important that we think about how we're talking about and with folks who are in crisis and how actually the language we use to describe the work we're doing is so important and can really get us on the wrong track. We don't, it's come up in meetings where folks talk about housing people and then the little, some language creeps in around putting people in houses or putting people in homes or where you house that person. And it's like, that actually is it diminishes so much of the work of the individual in self-determination and how much effort we put into making sure people have choices because the relationship between that choice and long-term success is so direct. So I get very precise about because it has consequences. It starts to roll into how we talk about the problem we're working on, and then we've lost sight of the problem. And now we're just doing any good instead of the right work for us and the right role we should be playing. There's, one of our purpose statement for Homer Trust is to be the difference. And we often, folks talk about making a difference a lot. And to be the difference versus making a difference is an example of like really sitting with that. And I'll ask, staff to sit with what that means to them. And it's a different experience from a different role completely. Totally. And so I do probably labor over that quite a bit, but it does show up. It shows up in how we value each other, how we value the folks that we serve, the agencies that we work with, their respect for us, how they see us. And so it shows up very much in language, but some might think I overthink it.
Yeah, I think that this is something that comes up in every organization, though, is how do we voice something? I worked as a psychologist for a while, and it really bugged me that people would I called them clients. People would talk about patience. A patient has a very different connotation, a different hierarchy than a client in so many ways. And it always bothered me. So I think that this is something that a lot of organizations think about. Some people might call it marketing at times, or again, language within their organization for culture. Would you agree with that, or am I going off track
Oh,
here?
yeah. Actually, it's a really, really great example, and has some interesting evolution in the work because, and we will still, it doesn't mean that we're kind of purist about it. Sometimes the word client comes up and other words. A community member is the respectful way that we'll often talk about folks when they're being engaged with uh, case management or housing work. But also, participant has been a word, and we've embraced that. We use that a lot. And it really came out of early planned and homelessness housing first work. And a participant, yeah, it kind of leans into the idea that, folks are, they, they are self-determining. Prior to that, organizations referred to consumers, and that really tried to emphasize that they have choice in work, but then it kind of, falls short and feels icky for a different reason. Recently, I was at a conference and it was, there was international um, translation. There was, and I don't know if it was from Portuguese or from Spanish, but a presenter, while they were presenting, they described their program and those participants as protagonists, and I thought that was such a cool segue because as a word like that just comes with a whole other feel to it. You're the protagonist in your own story, and there's and it just situated it very differently. So I think as words, that's a really good example of when we think about words, even if we don't suddenly start changing our vernacular for the whole sector all of a sudden, but just knowing the importance of it and thinking about it is that awareness that I think is important.
I've always believed that words have a lot of power, and the connotation of a word has a lot of power. I've often had a conversation with somebody where if I use the wrong word, I'll give you an example. I use the word, this person is a very savvy business owner. And when I used this with somebody that I was speaking with, my meaning in that is this guy is really clever. They know what they're doing. Not that, I didn't mean anything that they're going to take advantage of anyone or anything like that. It was just like this person is really, really clever at what they're doing. They took it to mean this person is a dirty, rotten scoundrel.
Oh
And
my.
and I didn't realize that until we were further down in the conversation, and how what a difference that made in our conversation there. I'm wondering, do you have any stories or ideas that come to mind, situations that come to mind where you've used language in a different way and it's had a very different impact with people?
um It might take me a minute for it because, quite frankly, I have so many small examples that they all mix together. I can say that I've had my fair share of apologies because I didn't mean um, uh, like the responsibility of the listening that you're speaking into. And that's just an important part of maturing in this work and in our careers is that we actually take responsibility and understand that people have different listening. And that's important. I'd say if you want to communicate, that's super important. Otherwise, you're talking to yourself. But um, I can think of, just more less about examples, but generally how I approach that. I would say I, I really take an interest in how people want to be described. I think a topic that's of interest, maybe and relevant to this, is homelessness versus houselessness. There's folks who are they really strong in reinforcing that people are not homeless, they're houseless, and there is a history to that terminology. Stakeholder is a word that actually the roots of the word and is very colonizing. It literally is referring to land being claimed because you put a stake in it, and the idea that it was not anybody's land in the first place. So using stakeholder and kind of and then sitting with, well, there's not a lot of good words to replace for stakeholder, but really thinking, okay, well, that's now you know better, you do better. And so now being sensitive and thinking about that, and then thinking about how you find ways of bridging in communication, uh, even when it's not going to be perfect and we're not going to necessarily say all the right things. I think that the alternative is, some folks get defensive or feel defeated, and they're like, oh, people are so sensitive. It's like, well, I mean, you can do that, or you can lean in and try to do better.
Yeah, that's a funny statement. There are a few people that come to mind when you say that, and they tend to. And then this is a stereotype as well. But in my mind, there are people in my life who have been really resistant to change because they're uncomfortable with thinking something different or changing in some way. And really, that's all it takes is saying, hey, listen, it's okay to learn and grow yourself a little bit here, because in using different language, we will change how we think about problems, which you've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, really. How did you come, like, what was the journey towards this belief in how important language is? Do you have kind of a narrative or a story that comes to mind on how you've come to this place?
Well, I think it would be fair to describe some of our early days, particularly as analogous really to a movement. There's a momentum and there's a lot of change, and we're changing even how we talk about homelessness, houselessness as a solvable problem. And I started to become like just really aware that most people talk about um, it as and just like without again specific examples, it was just defeating. It was just self-defeating, like that, like and language plays such an important role in motivating people and inspiring people, engaging in future possibilities. And so all of that is built around language. And I started to really pay attention to how you didn't have to actually come out right and say it, but it was clear if somebody says, well, we'll never actually solve homelessness. And if you're just if you're starting there, then how do you work on the issue if you actually just don't believe that you can? So I think just in that movement context, I saw a lot of reframe constantly of actually how important it was that we embed new language in the work we were doing, because the old language was actually part of the problem. It was part of a, like paternalistic effort to help people because they can't help themselves, or to, it's just really like that. So it really became apparent that even, small changes in the way that we described the problem changed the way we responded and allowed more space for discussion about it too, more space to challenge it. I can be very challenging as my traits. So I enjoy if I get really kind of, sometimes it's a real fault. If I get bored, I might pick a fight just to keep myself engaged. But in that, I also find that's an interesting space. Like let's talk about why you're using those words the way you're using them and defending them. I think it's a growth opportunity, but it is like part of a change over years of realizing that sometimes the language we use keeps us stuck.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I often think about arguments that my kids have. And often what I'm hearing is different than what they're hearing. What they're hearing is you hate me, or you're always against me with their sibling. What I'm hearing is somebody yelling, the sky is blue, and another person yelling, the grass is green. And I'm going, you guys, like you're there's no reason to even argue about this right now. But we need to separate things a little bit and have context, so we understand that. What I what I One thing I appreciate about what you're saying, Susan, is that as we change language, it allows for space to think, to question ourselves, to be curious. And as soon as we come to a place of curiosity, we start being willing to explore new ideas. We start to become willing to accept something that somebody else is going to say or hear it for the first time. And that the language and the connotation of so much of our language that is rooted in a whole bunch of craziness. Everything that we say, any word that we, especially English, it's such a unique language where it comes from everywhere. And there are so many languages involved in what put together English. But it's so old. Some of them, many of the connotations are so old that we lose that. I was listening to a program. I love learning. Listening to a program on the English language and just how crazy it is, really. And they talked about where the term burger comes from. Originally, there was no such thing as a burger. It was a hamburger because it was from Hamburg. There was no burger that was made of ham. It was a hamburger steak. And how now you can talk about a chicken burger or a fish burger. If you would have said that
Right.
100 years ago, they would have been like, what are you talking about, right? And how language changes. And I guess that's leading to my next question here, which is, as you've been in this for 20 years, as you were in this realm, this industry, this sector for 20 years, helping in a unique way, what have you discovered is essential in understanding how language changes and how you have to change your language? A word that might have fit really well 20 years ago no longer has the same connotation or needs to change in how you are influencing people.
Um, some things that come up for me are how words are becoming reintroduced. Like, the idea of somebody being hard to house. And we spent a lot of time, particularly also in the early days of the Housing First program and provincial and municipal strategies, reframing, just this reframe. Are folks hard to house, or have we just not got the right housing for them? The familiar sample of one. I know somebody and he wants to be homeless, right? So just, those kind of attachments. And then the evolution of that, and part of the challenge of like hard to house again, like it's do we just not have the right housing for that person? Do we have the right options? Have they been offered the right? Have we given them reason to hope that they can have and maintain their housing? Is this a veil that describes what they feel is a hopeless situation? So with that, am concerned sometimes that it's like the early startup energy where you're changing a sector, and we're putting a lot of energy into that kind of messaging. And if you pull your foot off the gas on that, or you think you've got it because everybody's on side and we have alignment, you go through a period, and certainly the last 5 years have had a big impact on all social services and certainly our sector. Suddenly all this language starts to creep in again. And so it's like attending to it is a constant. So those are some of the concepts I think that have mattered a lot and can come up for me more recently, because I'm starting to see things in the writing, in the sector where we would not have said that 10 years ago. What changed, and why are we tapping out to, that more defeatist kind of mindset? So that's an example. I'm sure others will come up for me as soon as we're done, because they come up very often.
I like the example that you gave of how, at least this is how I took it. Please correct me. The way I took what you said was, if we use language in a certain way, people see housing as a stopping point, a place to stay for a little while, rather than as a home. Is that kind of what you were saying on some level, based on how we understand this sector?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is certainly, maybe more broadly, I might describe it as just to really question the language. Are we using language to limit ourselves, and limit ourselves and contain ourselves, or to set a really low bar? Like, I think from the perspective of, I'm not going to die on a hill arguing about Bob and whether Bob has said that he wants to remain unhoused. But there's a few thousand folks that we're working really hard to house, and maybe we'll argue about Bob once we have found housing for everybody else that is desperately trying to find housing, but we don't have housing for them yet. So I kind of, why are we having that argument? I can really credibly tell you that we've, through community partners and amazing organizations, have just a range of circumstances of folks that would have been characterized as quote unquote hard to house or unlikely to ever be successfully housed, who, because of their involvement in a program that was really empowering, that connected them to other services, and in many circumstances that might have been treatment or medical services that they had not had in the past, are doing like incredibly well. So I've been shocked enough and surprised enough to, know better than to make any assumptions. So I think that's kind of, one way of thinking about it is to not use language that is limiting, that assumes like some defeatist, or like, I don't know. I just like, I can't get out of bed in the morning and think I can only do 50% of a job. Like that's my aspiration. I'm like, I really hope that, I can do 50% of what's I just can't. Like that just doesn't resonate with me. So
Again, you're reminding me of every other CEO, a good CEO that I know of, just because, again, you're not wired to do things halfway. You're not wired to say, I'll give it a little bit of an effort and see how it goes. You're driven to actually see it through. This is what you're saying. Which I appreciate in so many ways. I'm not wired that way all the time, and it's something that I really respect about entrepreneurs in general. When I'm thinking about a lot of things that we've been talking about, when you talk about language, when you talk about, and I use the word influence, I'm going to use the word sales for a second, just to position this question a little bit. I believe personally that we're all salespeople all the time. We're always selling something. We're selling an idea. When I'm glad that I sold myself to my wife and that we became married. I'm glad that sometimes I sell myself enough to my kids to listen to me. We're always selling something. And to me, I don't think of selling as peddling goods for my own good. I think about a good sale as influencing somebody in a way that is helpful for them, not from my perspective, from their perspective, in meeting their needs in some level, small or large. And in the same way, it helps me on some level. And that could be monetary, but it could also be, and it often is, especially with my family, is that I feel wonderful when things are working in the way that I believe helps everyone in the family. Maybe with that context, and again, if my vocabulary is just really, really not cutting it right now, challenge me. But in the context of selling an idea or influencing people in a way that helps them, and I'm talking about your employees mostly right now, what kind of sales process have you seen you need to go through to influence your community that you've created that is being the change?
um really concisely, it's an expression I use quite a bit. You just help me help you help me. Just
Hmm.
it's most government relations is kind of along those lines. And I think it applies to a lot of relationships. I would say, in my when I'm really feeling I'm in my wheelhouse zone, however you want to describe it, I really enjoy like mentoring. Mentoring's probably modeling, maybe more so in conversations with folks to help them think about the why, to help them with a thinking model that questions what their assumptions are and whether something's good enough or not good enough. In my worst scenarios, and some of the kind of vulnerability of my traits is that I'm very urgent and I can get caught up in the crisis management and don't have the time or create the time to do enough of that with enough people. And with different iterations in the organization, I have, kind of when if there's 80% of folks that are really solid and have been on board a while and I can work on 20%, that seems to be kind of a hum, because I get a lot of really like important feedback myself in those relationships. But when it flips and we've got a lot of new folks and there's more of that, it gets to be too much for my bandwidth to do that because I also really need to see the results. So I get tipped over and then I'm not that like high functioning person that I know I have been for other people. So I also know it's like it's a sweet spot, and my risk is when I'm stretched too thin and I can't do that all the time because my need for action and my need for results overwhelms. And it's a very classic outcome, but the experience is, I think, different for different people of why we don't delegate. Some people just, it's like they want full control or but there's little nuance in that. Some of it for me is, uh, yeah, there are some compounding things and you probably could, this would be therapy for me to get into all those reasons with your psychological background. But I think my sweet spot though is when I'm able to do that and it's modeling and just, really helping people question, like use their critical thinking, like, why are we writing this way? What and building a thick skin. Actually, that is a thing. I try to help folks build that thick skin that I really benefited from because of some of my education and being torn down and having to build up. And like, it just has helped me so much. And it's not every job that gives you the opportunity to build that. And so I try to create that. And sometimes, sometimes I might do it a little too assertively, but it's important to me. It's important to me that people grow around me.
Challenging people to grow, think,
Mhm.
change. Yeah, all of those words come to mind. Okay, that makes so much sense to me. What are, and I think that this is something that you were maybe not alluding to, but something that's coming up for me as you're speaking. If you have 80 people in an organization and the 20 new people are coming in, it is far easier to have the culture kind of rub off on those people. Whereas if you have an 80-person organization and another 100 are coming in, now that becomes a lot more difficult. There's far less control of how language is being used, as an example. You recently have been going through a lot of growth again. Maybe describe that specifically and some of the challenges that have come from growing so fast, and unless you've already mentioned them.
Well, it is a point in time. I mean, the pandemic feels in some ways like a long time ago, but as an organization, that recovery period post pandemic has also been some major projects at the same time that we've been developing and turnover in the sector across the board. Lots of folks worked really, really hard and to a point of burnout,
Mm.
keeping things going while, many folks were staying home and they didn't have that. We had folks that were every day still housing 120 people a month during every month of the pandemic. So in that period with Home Trust, it has been hit. And so I'm in the thick of that. So you're naming kind of really right now where I'm trying to identify it's not enough to say who we used to be, or, and I'll know that I'm doing that too much. It doesn't help new people for me to describe the past. It doesn't. So, and then trying to like create um, uh, finding the small ways that culture shows up. And it is a reality that there was a time in Homer Trust, like our senior, meetings, our senior leadership meetings, where we'd go through our exercises of checking in on our cultures and our value and describing, what it means to be the difference and not make a difference. We would, think of us as of a family and a very, very how like culture. This probably sounds awful, but if you don't you fit or you don't fit. Homer Trust has had iterations where you just really know it resonates with you or you just don't belong here. And that can be hard on people. That can be really hard on people. And but right now we've had a lot of change, and so taking steps to go back to okay, so the basics of when we were smaller, the CEO lunch and learns that I used to do more frequently because we're smaller, going back to doing more and more of those, um, me intentionally making the time for 2 levels down or 3 levels down in the organization conversations that are really human, because it's as you've grown, you can feel more distant than and I know I'm not my best self. If people see me as, somebody that just walks by in the office or, if I'm traveling a lot. So I making that time has been really important and going back to acting like we're small, even though we've grown. But it's definitely a challenge, and it's been a challenge really compounded by the circumstances the last 5 years.
And that's what we've been talking about this entire time. But what are three hurdles or tips? You can choose which of those three fit into either category that come to mind when I think about higher performing organizations and how what you've learned in your time throughout the iterations of what is now Homer Trust.
Well, I mean, it's taken me too long in some respects, and my, ability or kind of thinking that I had the ability to compensate for um, not enough systems, like organizational systems, and folks in some roles in some organizations, and I wouldn't say it's just our sector, but are almost like proud of not being bureaucratic, meaning that they don't, that they're feral, and and it can really rail up against trying to establish systems and being able to rely on those. And when the culture kind of you don't realize how much that's actually really hard. It's really hard to then bring in, when people are thinking, well, we're not a bureaucratic organization, that's bureaucracy. Well, it's actually, we just are too big to function without those organizational systems, and trying to overcome that. And I guess that's not so much a lesson I can teach others, but it's been one that I've been kind of, I don't want to say fortunate. It sounds really weird the way I'm describing it, but I was able to, fly pretty high with an organization where everybody kind of emerged with this momentum of this movement. And now as the organization's matured, it's taken a really conscious reset to say, I need to step back at a time where we're going through a lot more change as well. But that's a big one for me. I think there's I'm thinking of the things where we have to proactively maybe overcome our biases. So another is, social work and the skill of social work and the skill of peer support are too often not appreciated or valued as some of the professional skills that organizations also need, like, legal, finance, contract, all those other things that are so important. And, and we don't have like a sales space, but the communication space, having, on social work, it's really precise work. And you can do it well, or you cannot do it well, just like every other job. And so when you have an organization with such a kind of range of backgrounds of people, which makes us awesome, it's just kind of really diverse workforce, a really diverse in so many ways of describing it. You also have to be really intentional about that value and valuing the different functions and the roles in a really overt way, like talking about the value of that frontline work. And similarly, overcoming other biases and just I think there's a lot of really talented young people that don't get enough opportunity to kind of develop. And there's technical roles that are super important to our organization, right? And really, we could do a whole other conversation on the value of data and analytics and being really fact-based in decision making, but it can be taken for granted. So just like exposing all the time some of the need to overcome biases and to make sure that we're really conscious that that takes investment, development, authenticity, and proof, right? So if we're not using something to make decisions, and that's indicative of a problem. If we're doing work and we're getting that feedback loop again, if it's not shaping what we're doing, why are we doing it? If we know something and we're not sharing it with others, that's just interesting, but it's not helping us do our job. So being really, really kind of a bit of a edge on us and checking our biases and holding ourselves accountable for really what we're trusted with, which is a lot of public resources to do a really, really big job.
You've used the word authentic or authenticity a number of times here, Susan. What does authenticity mean to you? When you use that word, what is it meaning?
Um, wow, that's a really great question because there's so many canned answers that I could reach for, but it definitely is one I can answer a little differently in that if you juxtapose that, I know if I'm like, you can hear it in my voice. I'm very like transparent now, my emotional side. And if if I don't believe myself, why would anybody else? And if
Mm.
I'm not standing in and really confident in how I'm showing up, and empathy is wound up in that, because it also is authenticity requires us to, I think, by definition, really understand the perspective of others, to be really kind of thinking about how others are seeing us. So it's not just a personal thing, it's an organizational thing. So being authentic in terms of what our commitment is, And, it's a walking the talk. Another internal expression, onboarding expression is it's who we are. It's not what we do. So there's things in our values, there's things in our work and relationships that if we just, send the letter out or we check the box or we have the meeting, that's doing. But there's a difference in who we are. So if I find us saying, how we engage community, um, I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but it certainly has, like, lights can go on with somebody when they realize that they're checking boxes and they're going through relationship in a really managed way, but it's not what we do, it's who we are.
A summary that comes to mind as you're talking here, Susan, is that on an individual level, being authentic is fully believing something and presenting that. When we're trying to be the change, we cannot do that if we're not being honest with ourselves in what we believe, who we are, how we're made up, and that moves from individuals now to a larger community, which is Homeward Trust, and that community that is Homeward Trust needs to understand what you believe, and in order to be change. And then that now leads to a larger community in Edmonton, across the province, wherever it leads, right? I mean, I know that you connect with people nationally and internationally, so that this leads to a lot of different communities where, again, we need to fully believe something ourselves before we can be change to others. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, 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 very much so. You're much more
Okay.
succinct than me.
Well, I highly doubt that. Thank you for this. I'm going to be respectful of your time here, and we'll wrap this up. Before we do, I just wanted to mention a couple of cool things that I've learned about you. These are not I doubt these are the most important things to you, Susan, in getting to know you a tiny bit, but there's still outward acknowledgments of some things that you've done, and I'm excited about that. So there was the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal that you've received, as well as the Alberta Centennial Medal. What were those given to you for? What do those mean to you and your organization?
Um, I've, the recognitions that I've had in those kind of formal um, moments they mean a lot to me. Something that means a lot. I started earlier on, homelessness is political. I've been recognized and nominated for a number of those awards from really different political parties, and different leaders. And some of those awards are presented with the opportunity to recognize partners in community. And that's really important to me because I really do think, community, the inclusion in the work that we do is about, like, having just being housed is one thing, but the whole outcome is that community is better for it, right? Our whole community is stronger, and it doesn't split between the left or right in terms of any kind of politics. And so I'm mostly proud that I've had really good friends in and relationships in a lot of, different backgrounds, from and it just shows up in who's nominated me for things in the past.
Mm. Something that comes to mind. My wife was very, very involved in Girl Guides, as both as an attendee or a participant, as well as a leader. And something that she consistently talks about with the kids is leave it better than how you found it. Leave it better than how you found it. That this is something that consistently comes up in our lives, and that's a statement that's coming up as I think about you and Homeward Trust and housing people. Is leave it better than how you found it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a great expression.
Hmm. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your willingness to be authentic here. Really appreciate it. It's going to be fun to edit this later and to put in an intro and outro that do this justice. I will work to do that. But thank you so much for your time. My apologies. We got cut off there at the end. I'm glad that the tech glitch happened right at the end. It was kind of fortuitous. This, as normal with these podcasts, so much fun to do, and there's so much complexity here. Homeward Trust has experienced a ton of growth, And I think there are so many similarities. That's the first thing that really jumps out to me. So many similarities between Homeward Trust and any organization that's going through high growth. There are lots of consequences to high growth, both positive and negative, that we have to manage and figure out. I consistently have ways I think about others. I mean, I mentioned a prejudice I had during the conversation of like kind of saying, "Hey, I've got prejudice coming up to in my head here," and it's amazing how paying attention to my own language during this interview changed my thinking in such a short time, simply because it brought awareness to what I was saying. And you could hear me slowing down at times and thinking through my words. We see this when we speak about race or age or any other prejudice when we are in public. We watch our words just a little more carefully often. And this shows that I'm paying attention to my words. If I'm slowing down in how I communicate and take my time with word choice. I was thinking about this, and I'll throw the question out to anybody listening to this. How can we begin to think about words differently that we use in our organizations? Let this challenge us to think about this. I think the quote that Susan gave was, "The language we use keeps us stuck." The language we use keeps us stuck. And I was thinking about in an organization, how words are recycled. This is another thing that Susan talked about, is how certain words come back. And with those words come ideas. Words are intimately tied to ideas. And if we can really figure out how we're using words, if we can figure out what words are being used in our organizations in a way that we don't want them to be used, in a way that's not consistent with our culture or with where we're going in our organization, that shows us where people's mindsets are. And which I really, again, I really appreciated this about the conversation with Susan. Obviously, the largest part of this conversation was to do with language and how we use language. And I think very much about language, sales, marketing, influence. I think about all of these in kind of the same sphere and say, how are we influencing our customers, our clients? How are we influencing our staff? How are we influencing new hires? How are we influencing people who've been around forever? How are we influencing the public, general public on what's going on? A couple other just tiny little things that Susan mentioned that I think I'd like to bring a little bit of attention to. I love that she said you can have great systems or basically simply be feral. And I love the idea of this, of going so much of the documentation, I'll say language, so much of the language is sometimes around like, don't just build this big bureaucracy, which I'm all game for. I mean, as I'm recording this, as I'm getting ready to put this out, we've just had an election in Canada, and I'm thinking about this stuff, going, we don't want just a big bureaucracy. That's not the goal. The goal is to have systems. The goal is to have functionality. The goal is to have something that works. And I appreciate what she said there. And then the last thing, and I guess we spent a little bit of time on this, but was on authenticity. It has little to do with how we come across. This is the note that I took. Authenticity has little to do with how we come across and more to do with whether we truly believe what we are thinking and doing. So it is easy, very easy to say, I'm thinking about kids, like the stereotypical mom or dad who's smoking like a chimney and says, "Kids, it's not good for your health. Don't smoke." And going, do we really believe that? We're not believing it with our actions if that's what we are doing. Instead, what are we doing in our organizations? How are we acting? Do people believe that something is authentic because it permeates everything that we are? And I think that's a great point, is how much do our beliefs permeate our own life and actions? And if they do fully function in ourselves, that's going to come across to others as authentic without trying to sell anything. It's just going to be what comes across to the average person around us. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. I really enjoyed hanging out with Susan for an hour or so here. Thank you, Susan, again for this. And yeah, hopefully I'll be able to pick Susan's brain again at some point soon in the future. Enjoy your day.